Hi, and welcome to ForbiddenPlanet.com. We are very lucky today to be joined by one of my favourite and one of Forbidden Planet's favourite authors, Adrian Tchaikovsky. We're going to talk about many of his influences, his earlier works, and more notably, his newest work, Redemption's Blade, which is new out with Solaris. Hi, Adrian.
Hello.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your latest book, Redemption's Blade?
Redemption's Blade it's a heroic fantasy, and it essentially takes off from the point that the traditional heroic fantasy narrative finishes. So there's been a Dark Lord, effectively, the Kinslayer. He turned up with his armies of monsters and sort of martial races. He ran roughshod over the land of the free. He was defeated. He was killed by a small band of adventurers. And now what? And that's really where the book picks up. So the world is in utter devastation. There are a large number of monsters and similar things just kind of kicking their heels, also asking the question, well, now what? And it's about one of the heroes who was instrumental in bringing the Kinslayer down, trying to fix things, trying to continue to fix things beyond effectively the easy job of doing the fighting.
What's it like writing within a shared world, and how did the project with you and the other author and Solaris come about?
Well, actually, I got the easy job. Yes, book 2 is being written by Justina Robson, who had the unenviable task of having to follow on with all the stuff I'd put in. The main thing it influenced was I tend to be a very world-building focused writer anyway. That's what I start with my world, and then I let the world suggest to me the sort of stories it wants to tell and the sort of characters it would produce. And the main difference here is I just made fairly copious notes about everything I invented, rather than just throwing in lots of off-the-cuff things that I would later forget, so that there was a bit of a world bible to pass on to Justina. But one of the benefits of this project was I got a pretty much blank slate, so that after I was handed the initial concept, I could invent whatever I wanted for this world. I think it would have been a lot harder, and I suspect Justina's task has been a lot harder, because she's then had to work within the parameters of the things I've created, and with some of the characters I've created. So yes, the chief attraction when I was asked if I wanted to do it was, yes, absolutely, I just invent all manner of weird stuff that other people will then have to work with.
So a lot of your works and more recent shorter stories have come back to your most well-known series, Shadows of the Apt. Would you like any authors to be writing within that world? Would you trust anyone with that particular world?
That's a tricky one, because I tend to be very jealous of my freedom of creation. I know I would have to, I think, feel very strongly to want to dabble, and also at the same time you'd really want to do something that would be worthy of the source material. Mm-hmm. It will be lovely to write something into, say, the New Chromosome universe from Charlie Mayville, or maybe the Gene Wolfe New Sun kind of setting, but the problem is you get there and you think, well, would I be producing anything other than a rather pale imitation of the original? So that's a very tricky prospect. Not to say that if someone basically turned up and said, hey, would you like to? I wouldn't say yes, but I'd have to think very carefully about it.
I have really been enjoying the diversity of the characters in this particular book. Where does that fit into your timeline?
Because I start with the world, what usually happens is, because I'll have an idea of, well, here's the world, here are your sort of different groups of people, your factions, your sort of lineages and heritages, and that will then start to suggest, well, it would be interesting to have a character from here, because then if you would be able to see how they react to these people, you'll be able to see their particular sort of nuances. And in this case, obviously, because of two of my characters are former minions of the Kinslayer, and that was always going to be a bit of a given, because one of the problems I have with that traditional heroic narrative, so say with the Lord of the Rings narrative, is, well, what does happen to all the orcs? I think Tolkien kind of goes backwards and forwards on where orcs come from and what they are and what happens to them, and there is some idea that, oh, well, they all just kind of drop dead the moment Sauron goes away, or whatever, like, which is very convenient, but it's also it's a bit easy, and it sounds slightly like a euphemism for mass extermination that everyone then brushes over. And so I wanted to have, you've got a couple of effectively Uruk-hai style former elite soldiers, or in this case, elite soldier and some sort of dreadful blood mage, who happen to have turned on the Kinslayer and been instrumental in his defeat. And then how does the world view them? And what happens when you've got one of the great heroes of the Free People just palling around with these two guys? How is that viewed? And so obviously you get a lot of, there's a lot of, well, where does the blame rest? How far does the following orders card go? How much do you buy with that kind of last minute betrayal? And how justified are you in sort of characterizing this entire race of people who were also essentially the Kinslayer's victims in a very different way, as still being the enemy? And obviously, all of that arises out of that initial world setup, and that gives it lets you explore a lot of sort of themes that are germane to the real world, as well as being interesting to look at in a fantasy world.
Can you tell us a bit more about how it differs between when you're writing sci-fi and fantasy? Because you're kind of one of the authors that manages to kind of stride both extremely well. Is one preferable or quicker to write than the other?
I generally find fantasy easier to write, but that's mostly because the main demand there is to being internally consistent with myself. I tend to be fairly conscientious when I'm doing science fiction, and what that means is I tend to try and get the science right, and if I'm writing in the real world or in the near future of the real world, it then means there's a lot of knock-on research for geography and history and all. I mean, I wrote my first historical piece a little while ago for a Dracula anthology, and I decided I was going to set that in 1700s Hungary, and that turned out to be way too much research for a novella-length piece, because you hit the rabbit holes and you suddenly find you need to find out who the primate of Poland was at a particular time, and all that, and it does, because I do want to get it as right as possible, while kind of acknowledging that there's always going to be someone who knows enough about that period or that area of science who is going to turn up and say, well, actually, it's not entirely correct there. It does mean you can get bogged down in that kind of thing quite easily, and I love doing science fiction, but it's definitely harder work.
With the success of authors like Jay Kristoff and Sebastian de Castell in the young adult market, have you ever considered writing young adult?
I mean, I feel it's always been a bit of an artificial. I mean, it's a bit of a spectrum. I don't think there's a hard dividing line between adult and YA. Mm-hmm. A lot of people who read Shadows of the Apt are effectively in the YA bracket, just as a lot of people who read YA fiction are adults. Mm-hmm. The Echoes of the Fall series that starts with Tiger and the Wolf has a young female protagonist. It's a coming-of-age story. It could quite easily have been marketed, I think, as a YA. So, although I've never written anything specifically, I'm aware that, especially with genre fiction, it is a continuum, and there's a lot of crossover both ways. And I mean, for that matter, some of my favourite authors are YA authors. I mean, I've just finished reading Frances Harding's Skinful of Shadows, which is a phenomenal book. And I didn't feel. I think talked down to is the wrong phrase. I didn't feel that I was kind of reading simplified prose at any point, because her writing style is so beautiful.
So I've been looking at previous interview footage.
Sorry, I'm kind of aware that because I just what I say in any given interview is not necessarily consistent with any other interview I've given, because it is very much that thing that, although we like to think of ourselves as having this very concrete identity, we do vary moment to moment and over time, and therefore I'm well aware that answers I've given in past interviews have been superseded, and suddenly, actually, no, the answer was always this. Or but so, please go on.
So I hope this is still relevant. You've mentioned before about focusing in on the inhuman, i.e. Artificial intelligence, aliens within your books. How much of this is kind of based on real life events? Is it easier with what's happening in the world today?
I actually, it almost seems to be going backwards. If I look at Ironclads, which is a novella I wrote a few years ago and got published, I think now a couple of years ago, the world is now considerably closer to the dystopia of Ironclads than it was when I wrote it, which is kind of scary. Actually, here's the thing: writing within humans. I mean, there are lots of reasons I do this, especially just because that is what interests me. Mm-hmm. Something turned up I was just at the Nine Worlds convention this weekend, and I did a panel on writing villains. Mm-hmm. And the point came up that villains are frequently othered characters. They're frequently ethnically or in their sexuality or in their disability, they are shown as other and different. Mm-hmm. By writing othered protagonists, whether they're spiders or sort of bioengineered dogs or anything like that, really, that sidesteps that problem, because frequently that means that your villains are then far more the standard people, and it's the weirdness of your heroes you're focusing on. So you kind of avoid a bit of a problem that's been quite deeply embedded in fiction for a very, very long time. You have the villains where the inward corruption is shown by an outward corruption, which is obviously phenomenally problematic. So if your hero is a giant spider, then you kind of don't have that issue.
What are your kind of favourite worlds and favourite authors who are writing kind of alien species today?
There are certainly. I mean, I think that the two best recent examples of really interesting alien perspectives, Justina Robson's Glorious Angels has a race called the Karoo, who are really they're that magic middle ground where they are simultaneously genuinely properly alien. And this is something that, I mean, Robson's done this in a lot of her work. She's very good at that, whilst at the same time being entirely comprehensible to the reader. Because that's always the challenge when you're setting up your non-humans, especially when they're protagonists. Also, a very recent release, Semiosis by Sue Burke, which is actually very much in the same ballpark as my Children of Time. It's humans colonising an alien planet, and the alien planet already has something there that, and in this case, which they have no idea is there and don't immediately realise is a sentient sort of entity. But that's a really interesting read.
And what's next?
Well, next to be published will be the sequel to Children of Time, which I think we are going with the title Children of Ruin, although we've been backwards and forwards with various titles on that, and has been quite a long time in the making, because especially given the reception Children of Time had, I really wanted something that was going to be a worthy follow-on to that. But I'm very happy with what I've ended up, and I've got to do a lot of very fun stuff, and I almost broke my brain working with some of the non-human perspectives in that, of which there are several. I'm currently working on another standalone sci-fi art of that. The working title of which I may or may not get to keep, is The Brain Garden. And if the book is nothing else, if it gets called The Brain Garden, then it's going to have a memorable title.
And thank you so much to Adrian today for chatting to me.
Thank you.
Hopefully there's going to be more of this content coming soon with other authors, as yet to be announced. But from me here at Forbidden Planet London, thanks and goodbye.